Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. This August, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan completes 2 years in office, a tenure that has been both eventful and challenging. His election campaign was pegged on his vision of a Naya Pakistan that was inspired by the state of Medina. To tell us more about Imran Khan's performance, our guest today is Dr Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, Associate Professor of Political Economy at Quaid-i-Azam University, Islamabad. Dr Aasim has been involved in progressive political movements in the last 1 year and is an activist and columnist for many publications, including The Dawn and The Straits Times. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by asking you your thoughts on Prime Minister Imran Khan's 2 years in government. He completes his 2-year tenure this August. So what is your assessment of his leadership during these 2 years?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. I think it's hard to, look past this question, or sort of, in some ways, it's 2 years, yes, but the immediate context, of course, is the pandemic. It's sort of, as the saying goes, crisis brings out the best or the worst of not just in this case. I veer away from focusing too much on individuals and thinking more about structures and long-standing governing the regime in general. But there's no doubt that this pandemic has really sort of brought out the individuals in power as well. And I put Imran Khan into sort of a category of contemporary rulers, about which a lot has been written, right? So there's been a lot in recent years about what so-called populism in the academic jargon. And, just like, Modi next door in India, or Trump in America, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Bojo in the United Kingdom. There's a never-ending list. Erdogan, Duterte in the Philippines. These guys basically, speak big, make big promises, talk about being anti-elite, about anti-establishment. And of course, there's a huge literature, as I said, that suggests exactly the extent to which these claims are meaningful at all, and the extent to which they're just hot air. And the pandemic has really shown that up, right? It's in fact in America, in Brazil, India, Pakistan right now, where you see the pandemic. It's been managed poorly, more or less, in most parts of the world. But I'd say that this is what you see with these populist leaders. And so basically, just to respond to your question about 2 years, what happens with an individual like Imran Khan is that he's basically created this cult of personality around himself. And that goes both for his supporters, more generally. I don't just mean voters. I'll come to that. Like I separate the people who vote for the PTI from the sort of wider support base of the PTI. And then a cult of personality in office as well. So, in terms of the everyday governing regime. And that gets shown up, in a crisis-ridden polity like Pakistan, which even before the pandemic is always, dealing with any number of long-standing contradictions, of being a rentier state, of being a state with a very powerful military, of a very mobilized religious establishment, so on and so forth, let alone secular economic struggles and so on and so forth. So basically, that's what I would say. I think that the problem is that individuals like Imran Khan build up expectations. They talk about changing the system, and then, of course, critical observers knew that was never really going to happen. But then that then gets translated into everyday governing by surrounding yourself by a coterie of powerful sort of lobbyists. So, for instance, his most powerful advisors were basically members of what have recently been exposed as the sugar mafia, so to speak. People who control large sectors of the sugar industry, engage in widespread hoarding. And a government commissioned report, ironically, has exposed his same advisors. The most prominent was Jahangir Tareen. And Jahangir Tareen was also the guy who cobbled together the sort of electables, as they're called in Pakistan, in our constituency-based system, very similar to India, that were, pulled from different parties, from the People's Party, from the Muslim League, to create a majority in parliament, all at the behest of, the biggest power in the land, which is the military. Now, this is how he came to power, but of course, the narrative about coming to power was the polar opposite. And I think that's basically what's happened in these 2 years, is that the realities have been exposed, and in the pandemic especially so, where this cult of personality based on initially calling it a flu, or don't worry, it's not very serious, these sorts of things that in there's daily or every second day TV broadcasts, to then when June comes around realizing, oh, this is very serious. And that's what happened with Bolsonaro, that's what happened with Trump. Frankly, that's also what happened with Modi. And then the classic distractionary tactics. Oh, my corrupt predecessors. Oh, lockdown is bad because it affects the poor, as if, your policies over the past 2 years were very pro-poor to begin with. And then sort of the rhetoric ratchets up a notch. And in recent days, which I'm sure we'll come to in subsequent questions, the classic distractionary tactic, oh, look at our next door enemy neighbor, which of course Modi and Imran do interchangeably.
So what happens to Naya Pakistan, the slogan on which he had pegged his entire campaign, and that was the pitch that he sold to the people of Pakistan? What happened to that? Is that anywhere in the reckoning, or has it completely died down? What is
No,
your...
it's there, of course. As I said, as a rhetorical tool, it's there. Like even now, every day, every second day, there's a constant reference to corrupt elites, to the corrupt ruling regimes that preceded the PTI and Imran Khan. And yeah, the Naya Pakistan motif, comes up every once in a while as well. It's so broad and general that it can refer to anything. But, in many circles, again, of course, in critical journalistic circles, amongst, critics of the regime more generally, and of course, I would say amongst a large number of ordinary Pakistanis, it's become sort of a joke, this idea of a Naya Pakistan. So it's like now you'll see sort of circulating sort of half laughing, half crying kinds of adages about, well, Purana Pakistan was better than Naya Pakistan, sort of thing, like, or, all of the things that you see happening on a daily basis, the daily injustices of, it can be abuses of power against the poor, it can be patriarchal violence, it can be, militarism in ethnic peripheries. These things haven't changed. And so people will say, well, it looks like Naya Pakistan is just like Purana Pakistan, so it's there, like all of the other rhetorical tools that, as I said at the beginning, sort of populist leaders tend to employ, to basically, I think, gloss over the real contradictions and realities of, as I said, power and injustice and inequality, which, as we know, all around the world, even before the pandemic, were on the up, and in the last 4 months have just been given even more of a fillip.
So there was a report sometime last month in June where, it seemed as if the military had taken up important positions. People from the army had taken up important positions in airlines, in power, in public health. What do you think about this? Is this a new phenomena, or has it been happening and the report just summed up the developments of the last few months or years?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is quite simply, it's an ongoing phenomena over not just years but decades. There's now not a substantial literature because it's still quite taboo and quite risky to take up such tasks in Pakistan. But there's now enough of a literature that, people familiar with the country are aware that the military, like other powerful, what were called back in the day, were called Praetorian armies, armies with clear roles in ruling countries, from the classic Latin American armies of Argentina and Brazil to Indonesia to Nigeria. Pakistan was always in the mix, and Turkey, where even when the army is not in power, and Pakistan's army has ruled the country for the best part of half of its existence, but it still protects its corporate interests outside of power. And the fact of individual generals serving or retired being appointed to posts in the current setup is really nothing new, to be quite honest. It ebbs and flows. The numbers may go down, may come up, but the general, within the structure of power and within the structure of the economy, that has remained intact now for the best part. Started, I think, even the academic works will suggest, the major influx into sort of economic life via semi-autonomous army-run companies. They have a huge stake in real estate, for instance. They run so many of these private gated housing schemes. That started in a big way under Ziaul Haq in the 1980s. But there's a long history to this, which you can trace back to the colonial regime, right? Land grants for the British Indian Army soldiers. The higher rank you are, the more the grants you got. That practice continues to this day. So it's a wide-ranging corporate empire, and buttressed by, of course, a claim to being what they call the defenders of the ideological frontiers, so the physical and ideological frontiers. And the appointments in any one given regime to posts such as the ones you've mentioned are just one amongst many indicators of just the power they wield. And as I pointed out a little bit earlier, they're also widely believed to always be in the thick of the process that brings any at least on the surface elected regime to power through any number of cajolements and coercements. And in Imran Khan's case, this government, the PTI government, was widely seen to have had the backing of the army, and I guess that continues to play out now.
Okay, moving on to the state of the economy. Pakistan's economy has contracted for the first time in 68 years. So apart from the COVID, what do you think went wrong with the economic initiatives of the government?
Yeah, well, apart from COVID, of course, it's a big qualification, because that sort of over determines pretty much the sort of statistics like the one you've mentioned here, not just in Pakistan, all over the world. But to the extent that one can disentangle what's happened over the last few months from what came before, I think, again, it's sort of an old story with Pakistan. So it at least, again, it always starts with some kind of structuring story of history. And historically, again, for decades now, Pakistan has always gone back to the IFIs and to the IMF in particular. Almost every regime does so. It's been, once what was called structural adjustment, and it's gone by many names over the years, but basically debt as a percentage of total output, debt servicing in terms of the budget was just passed, in terms of a percentage of the budget, the highest single head, up to between 30 and 40%, depending on the kinds of stats that you employ. And it's just ballooning. And, it's like a vicious cycle. You're a rentier economy, between the national security logics of always allying yourself with powerful external strategic patrons. It could be America, it could be China. I'd even put Saudi Arabia in there. And then on the other hand, being totally indebted. And in the grips of, as I said, lobbies, very powerful. It could be sugar, petroleum, wheat. and you put all of those sort of ingredients together and you get a pretty toxic mix that, unless it's arrested with the appropriate political will, then it's like it's cumulative, right? And the indebtedness, I think, is cumulative, has accumulated exponentially in these last 2 years.
Moving on to foreign relations, what is your assessment of in Pakistan's relationship with India in the present moment? Last year, India repealed Article 370 on Kashmir, and recently Imran Khan has alleged that India was involved in the bomb blast that took place. So where do they stand? What do you think about this relationship between India and Pakistan in the last 2 years?
Well, I mean, I wish I could say that there's really much that's changed about this particular relationship compared to the long history of this relationship over the last 70 years. That it's not been, let's just say that this particular 2 years has not been one of the short periods in our 70-year history where there's some silver lining. Let's just put it that way. It's been, I think, bad, and like as I said at the beginning, both sides are run presently by populists that like to drum up, that I think drum up nationalist sentiment and jingoist sentiment, both because that's sort of their immediate, that their propensity to do so anyway, but also to distract from other things happening around them, and as far as I follow the literature in India, the BJP's victory in the last general election had a lot to do with the kind of rhetoric that was stirred up around the Pulwama attacks. So it's not that just tells you, that's basically, you could trace that to 2 years ago. So it ebbs and flows. One side or the other is always pointing fingers, and they've even now, I was reading, they've reduced their diplomatic staff in both of the high commissions across the border in recent days. So it's not great, and for me, I think the most important thing is again the fact that you have hundreds of millions of people who are constantly fed this rhetoric about the other side, and one government or the other is never going to undo that. At least not this kind of government on either side. You'd have to have, because inevitably the hawks on one side will sort of shoot you down if on the other side there's also a hawkish regime, and who's going to take the first step, who's going to sort of break the ice. That's always the challenge, and it's not going to be either of these two governments, is my sense. And sorry, you also mentioned the Kashmir thing. Of course, yes. That's ratcheted up a notch, right? And that is therefore, I mean, frankly, not just Imran Khan. I mean, I would say the same. I think a lot of ordinary people around the world would say the same, that what has happened in Kashmir and continues to escalate in Kashmir, and the lockdown. I mean, Kashmir was experiencing a lockdown before the world was experiencing a lockdown, and now that the world's coming out of a lockdown, Kashmiris are still experiencing a lockdown. That says a lot about what's gone on in India and under Modi, and I think with that in place, and already the kinds of underlying tendencies of Imran Khan's government, there's almost no chance. It actually provides an opportunity, for hawks in Pakistan and for this government then to just resort to the usual anti-India rhetoric. So really not much, as I said, has changed.
Beyond India, what have been the key foreign policy imperatives for Pakistan under Prime Minister Khan, and how do you think he has dealt with them?
Well, I mean, there wasn't much. Frankly, it started off when he came to power with, as I said, a real serious balance of payments crisis. And so, that whole populist rhetoric thing, as I mentioned at the outset. So before Imran had come to power, before the PTI had come to power, they were all about, we are not going to do the same thing that our so-called, so to speak, quote unquote, corrupt predecessors have done. And one of the big things, we're not going to go to the IMF. So they didn't go to the IMF for, I think it was almost 12 months. And so really, the Prime Minister's first foreign policy initiative was traveling especially the Gulf states, and saying, please help us out. So I'm not really sure what kind of initiative that is. There was also some, there was a brief period where CPEC, as you know, some of your listeners will know, that's one of the huge sort of not just foreign policy initiatives that the Pakistani state, I wouldn't say this government, the state has pursued in recent years. So there's some, let's just say, cooling of ties with China, and some signaling that, oh, some of the loan arrangements, some of that is going to further indebt us. But that's sort of given way more recently to a more, I'd say, the more standard posture of like, yes, anything China does and gives us is great. So there really hasn't been much that's new, to be honest with you, that I would say, okay, distinguishes this government from any previous government. And again, that speaks to the problems that both individuals and popular regimes that rely so much on rhetoric in this day and age face, right? Because ultimately, you have to put your money where your mouth is, and that hasn't really happened. But that hasn't stopped the mouth from continuing to make very grandiose claims. But on the foreign policy level, I don't see very much at all. And of course, in Pakistan, really, like all of these major sectors, the question, as much as anything as what they've done, the elected government, so to speak, has done, is how much power they actually exercise in making policy, and foreign policy in particular has for so long, again, for keen observers in Pakistan, been considered largely the preserve of the military, that the real question is, does Imran Khan and the government actually have real meaningful say in charting even a slightly different course? And the evidence doesn't suggest that either that they've charted a different course or that they could, even if they wanted to.
So going forward, what do you think is the Prime Minister's major challenges, and how do you think he'll fare in the coming 3 years that he has left?
Well, I mean, I'd say if I looked at it purely from a dispassionate standpoint, I was like, okay, this guy is in power and wants to stay in power, then really one of the big challenges is to keep his increasingly fractured coalition together, which in Pakistani politics is no mean feat, right? Because as we've discussed, it's a polity that features sort of a big elephant in the room always when there's a government in power, which is the military behind the scenes. And so in the last little while, what I called the electables that were patched together to give Imran his parliamentary majority 2 years ago, there's been evidence that majority is fracturing. So in the first instance, the challenge is just to keep it together, to keep the boat afloat, so to speak, and make sure there's no defections, and make sure that, in recent days, there's again, these sorts of little adages that float around in Pakistani sort of politics. So there's been talk of what has previously also been called at different stages during other governments, a -1 formula. So, maybe the government will, the rumor mill grinds. Oh, maybe the government will stay intact, but maybe there's a need for change at the top, right? A new prime minister, a new leader of the house in the parliament type thing. So, a lot of it is rumor and hyperbole, but that does tell you that an individual and a government that was 2 years ago that, swept, so to speak, to power with such a wave of sort of, this notion of something different coming. Now Pakistan, as you pointed out, is struggling to keep the electoral coalition afloat. The second thing, and how do you see him faring? I see him struggling with this. I see him struggling to manage all of the big elite lobbies that are both part of his government, that he's also, on the surface, is claiming to be challenging, to keeping the military happy, to keeping the economy afloat in the midst of what has happened with the pandemic. I mean, it's going to be a struggle. But I mentioned right at the outset, and I think it's worth, in some ways, closing with this, that on the one hand, there's the voters and there's sort of the electoral calculus. And then there's the big, powerful actors behind the scenes or lobbies within and outside the government. But there's also, I think, and this is a general phenomenon, I see this in India as well, that there is what I called supporters as a separate category, especially younger. Pakistan, like India, is in the midst of a youth bulge. Tech savvy young people, with access to information, globalized via the internet, so on and so forth. And not all of them are voters. Not all of them really operate within the logics of this constituency sort of politics that within which much of the electoral machine functions. I think his biggest challenge, the Prime Minister, will keeping them on board. Modi is similar, right? Really appealed to sort of a group of younger, a demographic that so-called wanted to see something different, also had aspirations for upward mobility. And those aspirations are not going to be met now, right? Because of the pandemic, even before the pandemic, things are not, there's not going to be many opportunities. It's not like a sort of a very, I would say, good times ahead. And so keeping the supporters on side, especially those who initially created that cult of personality in online spaces, on social media, I think that is now going to be increasing. And my concern is that, if you can't keep them on side by meeting their material aspirations or their desires for upward mobility, you are now then going to, as is already happening, going to resort more to the hate mongering, to the othering, whether that's within the country, again, is similar parallels to India, or whether it's to some paper tiger outside the country that is out to get you. And unfortunately, that harkens to more and more authoritarian methods and authoritarian approaches. So who's to say? But the challenge for the Prime Minister is to sort that out. I'd say the challenge for those who really are concerned with meaningful change as opposed to popular slogans is also to sort it out, how to think about getting this huge demographic of young people on side for something that is not hateful. It's something that is progressive. And of course, part of that would be for the region to move past its long-standing enmity in these two big countries amongst themselves.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aasim, for joining us today. This was a very insightful interview, and we really learned a lot from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You were listening to South Asia Chat, brought to you by ISIS. If you want to learn more about our work, please visit isas.nus.edu.sg. Thank you.